Welcome to week 6, in which we cover the next key concept, narrative and communication. The structure of today's lecture is going to have an introduction in which we cover the basics of narrative and communication, ask what it is, and then do what we usually do in this subject, which is complexify or complicate our everyday assumptions. In part 1, we're going to be thinking about how it organizes our experience, and in part 2, we're going to attempt to answer the question why it matters to networks. And in part 3, we're going to try to then apply that to what that means for the internet and for social networks on the internet in particular. So let's get started with our introduction. I want to ask you this question just in terms of your opinion, not in terms of what a dictionary might say, but what does the term narrative and what does the term communication mean to you? Take a moment to just write each of those words down, maybe on one piece of paper, create a table with narrative on one side and communication on the other side. And then underneath it, try to define narrative. And then underneath communication, try to define what that is. So it looks like this at the top of your page. Most people, I find, when I ask them to define narrative, give me a synonym such as story. Sometimes they might say it might be a myth. And if I say, come on, I want a different synonym, this is the process I take people through. People will sometimes say, well, there's narrative poems. There's different kinds of poems, pastoral poems, but there's poems that tell stories. Maybe there's songs that tell stories. So you get the drill here. Take a bit of time to try to add 4 more synonyms for what you think the word narrative is. And don't cheat. No looking up synonyms for narrative on the internet. This is just out of your own imagination and creativity. Then do the same with communication. What is the synonym for communication? When I ask people this, one of the first things they say, well, it's a message. Other people often say it's a direction, like an order. And that usually triggers people to say, maybe like a map could be a form of communication. And then I ask people to add 4 more. What we generally get there is a dichotomy or a binary, where on one side of the table, on the communication side of the table, we get a sense that these things are nonfiction, that this is communication as information transmission. Now, what I want to suggest to you is something that scholars have been talking about since the time of Plato, that even the most basic forms of communication are, in fact, in some ways influenced by narrative and by culture and by perspective. Much in the same way as we learned by the reading through maps by Wood et al. When we were doing the key concept of place and space. How we are placed in space determines the stories we make about that place and how we then make our maps, which are not just objective representations of the real world, but rather narratives. This idea that information or facts could have a narrative element to it and not just be objective fact really troubled Plato. Plato had an idea of language that when people said a word like tree, it was as simple as them saying the word tree. They would imagine the ideal tree in their mind. And when someone heard the word tree through their ears, they would also imagine the ideal tree in their mind. So it's a simple model of codifying and decodifying, sending the message, transmitting factual information. And so Plato said that words are based on imagining what he called this ideal, this Platonic ideal. He even thought and supposed this wacky idea that somewhere in the universe, these Platonic ideals were real, actual, hard things that you could touch, and they just sort of existed. Like a trove of images we could just pull out of drawers, and we were exchanging these images. Now, when Aristotle, who was a disciple of Plato, came along, and he began to theorize communication a little bit more, he wrote a book called Rhetoric. Plato was very, very concerned about utopias or trying to create the ideal societies. There's still types of people out there today. Maybe if you're an urban planner, you're trying to create the best possible town that you can, the best possible university that you can if you take on the role of being the vice chancellor, for example. That was the kind of person Plato was. And his philosophy was based around the city-state of Athens and trying to come up with a form of governance that happened in the forum through discussion that was direct participatory democracy, in which a citizen of Athens, the city-state, should he have the ideal amount of education, could, through discussion and debate, come up with the ideal ways to govern and come up with solutions for that city-state. Aristotle was a little bit more of a philosopher the way that we probably think of it now, not somebody who was actually trying to come up with direct applications of his ideas, for instance, as Plato's The Republic does, which is his ideal republic governed by participatory democracy, but rather trying to take apart the mechanics of like, well, how does this actually work? And his book Rhetoric is where, if you learned in high school the 3 or 4 basic principles of giving an oral speech, for example, that's where that comes from. He started kind of, well, how actually does communication work? Does it really work in terms of this transmission of ideals out there in the world that are sort of floating in the ether somewhere? And he designed this model of ethos, pathos, and logos. And some people add to that chronos, which means time, as the 4 aspects of the way in which a young Athenian citizen needed to be educated in rhetoric to understand, first of all, how best to present his ideas in the forum, but also how to best decode other people's ideas when they were presented to him. Ethos basically translates to credibility. How do you establish your credibility? Well, if you're well educated and you've gone through the system of education that Athens provided to their male citizens who were over the age of 30, which was only 30% of the population, they were free citizens, not slaves, yada, yada. Well, that would then give you the credibility. You had come of age. You were given all of the cultural capital that you needed. Don't need to worry about ethos. If you're let in to that institution that was the forum at that time, you have credibility. And then he said, there's pathos. That's how you move people. It's how you move people to tears or to laughter. It's how you create empathy in storytelling, for example. And then finally, there's logos, which is the logical process. It's how we come by a process of discussion and discernment and sorting ideas to the most logical consequence or way forward. And so he comes at it from a slightly different angle from Plato, but he says there's 3 components, maybe 4 if you add chronos, which we often forget, which was timing. And he said, this is how communication works. This troubled Plato because he really didn't like pathos. He said that was the thing that poets did. Poets who wooed women or moved people to tears. And he wanted to banish poets from his republic because he felt they were so dangerous. Given that ethos, if you were a well-educated man, was already established, pathos, according to Plato, should be banned from the ideal republic. This brought us to a society that when we came to rediscover and really focus on the ideas of the Greek philosophers during the Renaissance and the subsequent Enlightenment, a society that focused on logos, the word, as the main way that we just communicate transmission of information without thinking about feelings or credibility or timing, just logic. And that's basically, to this day, the way science likes to think of the transmission of knowledge, a very unproblematic transmission of facts. And I'm going to pose to you that where you are situated and who you are, for instance, if you don't get to be that male Athenian free citizen who is 30 years old or over and who is given the right amount of education to enter the Athenaeum to debate these ideas, who you are, from what perspective you are, does determine to a certain extent the images you have of the world, your perspective, and therefore what you communicate, how you communicate, and your vision of the world too. So just give an example here. We've got this ideal tree. Now you can hear my Canadian accent. Growing up in Canada after a long, long winter, when the deciduous trees had lost their leaves, and then a beautiful spring when everything comes into flower. For an average Canadian, they might think of this as the ideal tree, the tree in full summer bloom. But somebody over here from Queensland might think of it the other way. This is the tree they've seen on their beaches when they're relaxing, for example. Now, this might be based on the tree that they see every day. Or you could cross switch that and go, actually, a Canadian who's in the freezing cold winter, their ideal tree would be the tropical one. And to a hot North Queenslander, their ideal tree might be the one that actually can drop its leaves, give you a beautiful, colorful autumn, and then cool you off once in a while. Perspective, though, matters in terms of the images that we get in our minds. So what I want to suggest to you is that dualism that we have, that binary that we have between communication and narrative and communication is false. It's a bit more muddy than that. In fact, most communication draws on some extra essential information as well. It's not just the facts map. Now, a really obvious example is the kind of map that the British Empire would circulate at their height of the Victorian era. Now, this map is filled with things. We already know from our key concept week that focused on place and space that it is already a perspective. Even if you took out all of the stuff around the side, even if you took out, Britannia sitting on top of the Atlas who's holding the world, even if you took out all of the pictures, like for instance, the sergeant of the British military, or the colored subjects who are subjects of empire, you would already know this is a map based on a perspective, which is the Mercator map, which tends to emphasize the prestige of the North, which puts the North on top, which shrinks the size of Africa, for example, and which puts the Atlantic Ocean right in the middle. You can see the prominence of British Empire in this map just from that perspective. It's a map from which all roads, in this case sea roads, lead from London, or from Manchester, should it be. But there are other things that if you've gone through high school and given some basic ways to decode some visual communications, you would have some other things in your tool belt. And you'd be asked, for instance, well, what is the tone of this? Well, it seems like it's probably official communication. It seems like it's Royal Britannia. It was a map of empire, so it was perhaps something that was commissioned for empire. And then when you look at the pink bits of the empire, you see India and Australia and South Africa, Canada. Oh, yes, it is. It's a map of empire. It's very serious, full of pomp and circumstance. The tone, therefore, is meant to impress. The salience is, what is the relevance of this? What does it refer to? What is the referent? It's referring to the subjects of empire, both the land and their people. And its embellishment also tells us something about this piece of communication. It's highly decorated and it tells a story. Theorists of communication will call that embellishment a paratext. So even in communications that are less obviously embellished than these ones, they would say that there are things that we can look at to help us decode these sorts of circumstances. For instance, Gerard Genette, who we'll talk about later, introduced the term paratext, the things around a text. So for example, the foreword or the acknowledgement or the publisher's imprint or the cover of the book. Many people say never judge a book by its cover, but everybody judges a book by its cover. If it's a hardback, it seems like it's a serious one. If it's given a beautiful, beautiful artistic cover these days, it probably means that the publisher invested in it more than something that might have been self-published, for example. The author's blurb, the advertising, the back of the book, all of this is paratext. And it informs the way that we, not just as scholars, but general readers, also tend to interpret information in a book consciously or subconsciously. Now, sometimes people kind of go, yeah, well, those are some examples. Sometimes, sure, the line is blurred between narrative and communication. And, in maps like that, we learned the other week, they're all from certain perspectives. And they had to stretch them because when you try to transpose three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional space, you're going to always get some kind. But just the facts are possible. Now, a postmodern theorist who troubled that idea, that even the basic facts of history are always organized by narrative, is a theorist called Hayden White in his book Metahistory. He said even the telling of history depends on how we shape it, from whose perspective we tell it, and for what audience. And he began to show that history books can be classified into the shapes that their plots take. These shapes that plots take tend to be genres, but genres also can sometimes mean something about the message that's being communicated through the text, how we are meant to understand something. So generally when we talk about genre now, we go to a bookstore, we think about the fantasy genre, or we think about our Netflix queue and we go, well, there's the comedy and there's the romance, and then there's documentary. The documentary is the facts, and then there's the animated movies or whatever. Hayden White he wasn't a literary scholar, he was a historian, and he had kind of slightly different definitions of genre. And he used them in ways that we're probably unfamiliar when he actually said all histories, even documentaries, can be actually broken down into 4 categories. He said there's the romances, the comedies, the tragedies, and the satires. And he described them following the work of people like Northrop Frye, who were structuralist scholars in the 1920s to 40s, who did some really early work on genre and also used the word in a different way than we might understand it today. And I don't want that to confuse you. You don't need to worry about how they were using these terms. I just want you to think about the shapes that he said histories can take. He said there can be the hero's triumph over evil. So, for instance, the story of the conquistadors who conquered Latin America, who subjected the Aztecs to their rule, would say that that was a victory, that they banished the awful sacrifices that those people did, the bloodletting, the sacrifice of virgins and children, and all of that stuff. And they would tell that story of conquest as a hero's triumph over evil. Or he said you could also have a joyous narrative. It's a celebration, a comedy, for example. And in Shakespeare's comedies, they often end with a kind of a marriage, a nuptial, a bringing together of the social world and the natural world. And so he said, often things that celebrate federation or celebrate states, the bringing together of the colonies of Australia, or the bringing together of the provinces of Canada in one giant state. What a wonderful thing. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is girt by sea. Our home is one giant continent now. How wonderful that is. Advance Australia Fair. That would be a comedy. Joyous national celebration of the union, of the land and state politics. Not so joyous if you were Indigenous, perhaps. Or a tragedy, a hero learns to accept limitations of the world. For example, the explosion of the Challenger, or other accidents that happen during the space race. We're learning more and more scientific knowledge, but every once in a while we have to learn that there are limitations and there's tragedies that happen. Or satire, he would say, is a version of the past where people are captives of an evil world where injustice prevails. For example, the Diary of Anne Frank. So he said, histories are shaped by genres, just as stories can be classified into genres. And they tend to depend on whose perspective, from what position. So even the facts of history and how they're organized require narrative. They rely on narrative. But I also want to flip us around now and think about how narrative also contains information. It's not just fiction. It can also have nonfiction reference in it. So for instance, the early folklorists, we've got a picture of the Brothers Grimm here, but there were a number of them at the turn of the 19th century, the 1800s, who went around as early anthropologists collecting stories from folk who lived in villages, often people who hadn't been made literate yet because we didn't have universal literacy. Stories that had been told from generation to generation, perhaps around a fire or at bedtime, for example. And they found that there were patterns to them, that there were similar types of folk stories in every culture. And what we could tell about the changes between them, for instance, the different versions of Cinderella, could also tell us things about that culture. But also there were things in those stories when they are written down now that tell us about the society in which this oral story was circulating when it was written down. So, for example, now a lot of these stories often are illustrated with the witch's broom, and we associate this witch with a evil. But of course, this broom was just a woman. She was a woman who was illiterate. She hadn't been educated, and she was living in a rural area, perhaps. And this was her form of knowledge, which was seen as a challenge to what was beginning to emerge as a more dominant form of literate knowledge. We can also see things like in Bluebeard, from the black and white picture below, there's other historical references. So, for instance, to a cutlass that the brothers who come to rescue the maiden, their sister, from the evil Bluebeard used. And we can date that story then from the reference to the kind of weapons that were being used. At least we can date the writing down of that story to that, for example. But there are other things that folklorists have begun to read into some of these fairy tales, for example, because they were not originally designed for children. They were just tales that people who could not read or write told one another as forms of entertainment before there was radio or television or anything, really. So they had folk knowledge in them. But they also sometimes had morals in them that tell us about attitudes in the society at that time. So famously, for example, the emperor's new clothes tell us things about the emergence of people beginning to doubt the sovereignty of the emperor, doubt his ability, where previously in the great chain of being, the sovereign was meant to be the most absolutely wise leader that you could think of ever, and who would doubt his knowledge because it came from God. In this story, we have a an emperor who's lost his marbles and is taken in by shysters who sell him in invisible clothes, and he parades through the village. He's lost it, and everyone laughs at him. And folklorists say that we can see the emergence of early democratic ideals going on in the transmission of this story. Often we can think that narrative is fiction, and that communication is about the transference of nonfiction. And of course, the Dewey Decimal System, when we go into the library, that's the basic binary that they classify all information transmission with. You've got your fiction or your nonfiction. So it encodes that binary too. And I want to propose to you that many people have said it's the rise of empirical science, the scientific method, in the Enlightenment period and the aftermath of humanism that actually enshrined this idea that objective facts are the real deal. They are never to be contaminated by story, and everything else is just frippery. It's just decorative. It's just for entertainment. Those of us who study literature know that's not true. We study literature often because we want to see in it the historical attitudes of a given period. For example, we want to think about the cultural shapes that are taking place in fiction, for example. And people who study communication, for instance, history tellers often know that narrative is encoded in history, and they will often critique each other's histories from different perspectives to try to work out whose is the most truth-telling or accurate, for example. Even telling the news, I think we're increasingly aware, is shaped, right? In that way that Hayden White said that history telling is shaped. So even telling current events is shaped. And how is it done? Well, for instance, we focalize on certain things. Certain things make the headlines and other things don't. There tends to be a Western bias, for example, even in social media with the hashtag pray for Paris. People will often react against that and say, there's been a war going on in the Middle East. There's been terrorism happening in Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq for decades, and no one ever hashtags pray for Kabul, although perhaps they may be right now. There's also omission. So for instance, in the Townsville Bulletin, you'll find that there's very few articles that will rail against real estate development. And if you're an urban planner as well, you would probably notice that. And that's probably because the commercial developers in Townsville are very prominent in terms of the advertising revenue that they give to the Townsville Bulletin. If you pick it up on any given weekend, you'll see it has a giant insert filled with all of the developers' commercial developments for sale. So there's other things that are often omitted, for example, from newspapers, and these are things that historians have critiqued over time as well. For instance, the U.S.-sponsored invasion of East Timor only took up 500 words in the New York Times. So focalization and omission can be political and also represent perspective. There's also headline setting. Even if wrong, the corrections to those notes are required to be printed, but they're often printed in such small print on the inside of a newspaper's front cover that nobody even notices. So for instance, one of the headlines that came across our radar a few years ago was air pollution is now the leading cause of cancer. And it caused everybody to be like, that's it, right now we need to go to electric cars. When in fact, it is actually not the case. And subsequently, you can fact check that and look up that story too. Affect too. So it's not just the facts, but we tell stories in ways that influence people, not just in the editorial part of the newspaper, right? Now, they were concerned about this in the early days of newspaper, and the government was in particular concerned with the way in which the rise of photography was introducing the element of pathos to the news, which they hoped should just be based on fact. So they banned photographers from the front in World War I, because when people were seeing how awful the battle in the trenches were, it was actually causing people to not support the nationalist cause of war anymore. Contrary to that, during the American war in Iraq, they embedded journalists. CNN basically airstreamed that to our TVs 24/7, all the way through the early 2000s. And that was very strategic. It was to show how hard these American soldiers were working to bring peace to such an unsettled area. And it was to sway the American public toward a particular cause, which was their patriotic one. We also these days need to think more and more about the genres of the news. The rise of tabloid journalism is actually relatively recent. It's only come within the last 100 years. People were very worried about the introduction of gossip and the gossip column. And when it first started to appear in society news in the 1920s, it was seen as very déclassé, low class. The news should just be focused on the facts. But people are interested in a juicy, salacious story. It sells newspapers. And so more and more tabloid journalism began to inflect, in particular, magazines. But it's also started to infiltrate the previously legit daily press, which now also increasingly relies on clickbait. You might have noticed this story recently was carried by The Project, I think maybe just this week, where they looked at again and again the number of times that Woman's Day, which is supposed to be, I believe, a weekly magazine and is not supposed to be a tabloid magazine. It was supposed to be something of the caliber of, say, perhaps the Australian Women's Monthly, just a women's magazine, was beginning to look something more like the National Enquirer. And again, speculating divorce between Meghan Markle and Harry. Now, in fact, this was sent to the National Watchdog over news, and it was found that it was blatantly incorrect and a breach of media standards. And so Women's Day was forced to actually print a retraction, but again, it was printed in very small print. And they said, our readers basically understand the contract between reader and magazine, that this is tabloid journalism, and they're smart enough to understand the difference between truth and lie. We could say, however, that this infiltration of tabloid into what was previously concerned with mostly just the facts of news is a form of blending of two mediums. And this is something that the theorist of narratology, a field of study that emerged out of the need to kind of get ways to talk about how complicated narrative can be, a theorist called Gerard Genette introduced, called bricolage, where he said a lot of media actually has different forms within it, lots of kinds of code switching. And increasingly in 2021, we're seeing the internet is becoming a busier space with multimedia. We've got film and we've got advertisement and we've got, you open something and it's got advertisement pop-ups and all sorts of things. And we understand this very, very well. So the takeaway is that it's complicated. There's a false dichotomy between narrative and communication. And communication as mere information transmission also draws on story. And that is because nonfiction modes such as history and the news, or maps that we often associate with communication, or just information transmission, and facts of communicating truths rely on rhetorical shaping and narrative elements that we often associate with fiction. And so-called fictive modes such as fairy tales often have historical truths in them, and thus also communicate some forms of truths, even cultural truths. And communication also relies on style, formality, seriousness, tone, informality, codes, what conventions. Is this tabloid? Is it legit news? Video, illustration, photograph, cultural conventions, mediums. And these are all aspects that we often associate with narrative. And of course, things like focalization, selection, omission, and highlighting. So that little table I asked you to create with your synonyms under narrative and communication as a binary was a little mind game I was playing with you, to ask you to look at that now and think, are those really as separate as I think they are? Is narrative really as separate from communication as I thought it might have been? The other takeaway, besides the fact that it's complicated, and we're going to dig into some of that complexity today, is that without communication, we are lost. We learned last week when we thought briefly about Lacan and his ideas about identity and self, that even the boundaries of self and other are organized by language. I know what is me, and I know what is you, by recognizing the boundaries of my body in the mirror and pointing at myself and hailing myself in a symbol that I call me, or controlling my mother with a cry that says, come here. Those are the ways that we learn what language does. It describes, it controls, it moves. Now, you might think Lacan is way out there, but I've got someone way more even out there than him for you to listen to now in this break between the introduction and the rest of the lecture. It's a very long TED Talk that's given by Jill Bolt Taylor that subsequently was turned into a book called Stroke of Insight. She's a neuroscientist, and she's interested in how the brain transmits information and how we make sense of that information that we gather from our senses. And she herself had a stroke. So when her brain began to shut down and her understanding of how the hemispheres works translates to this really powerful insider story that she tells. And of course, in perhaps today's society, nothing seems to us more compelling or more convincing than the ethos or credibility of an insider, somebody who's been there herself. So she was a scientist who also had a personal experience of a stroke. And she talks about the loss of her language facilities in this particular video. And the loss of her language facilities meant she had a loss of an ability to organize data in her world and to understand where her body began and where the universe began, where her body, ended and where space began. So if you just want to quickly get a sense of what I'm talking about and not spend an hour looking at this TED Talk, I recommend that you scroll to 4.41 and watch it to about 9.5, and you'll get what I mean. Now we're going to unpack what this means for how complicated narrative is and how we can then transpose these ideas for what that means for networks.